I don't even check.
Yeah, no.
Okay, all
Okay,
trying to get him.
Oh, cool.
What
That's
are you
what-
doing?
oh, just this,
You're working
unmute.
for the-
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because that's what I was looking for. Okay. Yeah, that's what I was saying.
Turn it all the way up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did get him. Our very first, 5 years ago, our very first.
Yeah, a couple of, yeah, that people are like somewhere. Yeah.
Wait, tell me when.
Federal.
Okay.
Federal equity
Just
initiatives.
do a little sit down.
And then also looking, working with a bunch of municipal.
All right, I have to take my glasses off for that.
officers
Okay.
to figure out what kind of innovation is happening. If you're.
Yeah.
All right, we're gonna get started, everybody. Thank you for joining us today at this Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project book talk. I'm here with author and scholar Victor Ray, and we're going to be talking about his latest publication on critical race theory. Thank you so much for joining us. Professor Ray is the F. Wendell Miller Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and African American Studies at the University of Iowa, and a non-resident fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institute, and most importantly, a Carr Center Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. His research applies critical race theory to classic sociological questions, and his work has won multiple awards, including the Early Career Award from the American Sociological Association's section on racial and ethnic minorities, and the Southern Sociological Society's Junior Scholar Award. He's also a dad. I always say that. That's when women, no, it's so true though. When women are always like, hey, she's the mother of two. He's also a father. And this is, so that you all know, this is our very first race research and policy portal author conversation. So we're very excited. We're going to be kicking off this series. We'll be continuing it in the next academic year. We're really pleased to be joining us. I'm going to turn it over to, also, this is our last event for this academic year. So stay tuned for TNT in the fall, Truth and Transformation in the fall. We'll be reviving our IRA IOP speaker series, and then we'll do some more of this.
Great. So I'm just going to let you all know, I'm going to read a little bit from the intro of my book, and then we are going to have a conversation and then open it up to Q&A from folks here and from online, if possible.
Yep.
All right. Excuse me. I was 2 years old the first time the cops were called on my family. At a parade in downtown Pittsburgh, my Uncle Harold lifted me to his shoulder so I could see over the crowd. His behaving as loving uncles sometimes do led someone to jump to the conclusion that my dark-skinned uncle had abducted a light-skinned toddler. They told the police. Kidnappers aren't known for taking stolen children to parades or anywhere with large crowds. Nonetheless, the police questioned my uncle, letting us go when they were satisfied that we were a family. Variations on this scene repeated throughout my life, from infancy to the present. When I was about 10, a white woman driving past our trailer called the police on my dad for playing with me in the yard, again criminalizing family joy. When we were teenagers, white clerks followed my brother around stores where I walked unbothered. Questioning and threatening stares still occasionally greet my mixed-race family as we go about normal tasks. Even now, when my family gets together, we are sometimes asked if and how we know each other. My experiences with racism reflect aspects of America's broader racial system. The assumption that my uncle and I weren't family is tied to our nation's peculiar racial categorization system, with its singular one-drop rule and its long history of bans on interracial marriage. Such bans would have outlawed my parents' union and were intended to prevent my birth. Assuming my black male caretakers were dangerous and deviant rather than loving and conscientious reflects the routine criminalization of Black people's family lives and gendered stereotypes about Black masculinity. And as a seemingly endless series of videos of police violence against unarmed Black men has shown, calling the police and falsely accusing a Black man of stealing a child put lives at risk, regardless of the fact of innocence. By connecting individual experiences to broader patterns of racial inequality, stories like mine have shaped critical race theory. Critical race theory recognizes that narratives influence our understanding of the world and uses stories as an empathetic bridge across racial divides. Stories can help outsiders understand and connect with the unfairness, capriciousness, and cruelty of racism. Critical race theorists recognize that narratives may not, in and of themselves, be compelling evidence. So they couple stories with meticulous research, highlighting America's profound racial inequality, showing how race and racism shape people's lives. By highlighting the stories of how people of color navigate and survive American racism, critical race theory provides perspectives often conspicuously absent from mainstream books, movies, and media. One reason I wrote this book is that people are trying to erase and turn back the relatively minor inroads critical race theorists have made getting these stories told. I was introduced to critical race theory as an undergrad at Vassar College when I transferred there from the Borough of Manhattan Community College. Contrary to the idea of colleges as radicalizing institutions, my introduction to critical race theory was more confirmation than revelation. I enrolled at BMCC right after 9/11 when, like many New Yorkers, I reevaluated my life. BMCC was just blocks away from the World Trade Center, and the college had lost students during the attack. When I started taking classes there in February 2002, the college served a broad swath of New Yorkers and students from all over the world. I quickly became involved in student government and anti-racist organizing, doing things like testifying in City Hall against tuition increases for some of New York's poorest students. After 2 years, I moved to Vassar, a small liberal arts college in upstate New York. The contrast between these two schools was intense, and it was clear to me that they were preparing people for different places in the social hierarchy. Despite the glaring resource differences between these schools, I watched administrators at both use similar tactics to avoid meeting anti-racist student demands for things that racial justice activists have been fighting for since the 1960s. My personal history primed me to understand critical race theory because I had witnessed highly variable treatment received by my family members of different hues. Because I'm often read as white, I heard the ways white people, thinking they were alone, sometimes spoke about people of color. These interactions included the relatively subdued but nonetheless harmful racism that's common in American culture, like asking if I felt safe living near Black people, or jokes about the supposed inferiority of culture or language. Sometimes these comments included more blatant racism, like being told Black folks in a fancy car must be drug dealers, or when a white Vassar student suggested that the cultural center for students of color should be torn down and replaced with, quote, whites only parking. Scholars have documented differences in whites talk about race in public and private, with considerably more animus and casual racism employed in what they call the white backstage. When I read the foundational critical race theorist article, Whiteness as Property, which used passing as a launchpad to explore America's history of racial plunder, I knew I had found it intellectual. I think I'll stop there and we can finish.
Thank you very much. So I prepare a few questions, and as usual, I'm going to go off script. But I think you talk about it a little bit, and critical race theory is this term that has become widely misused in the media, and I think it's fair to say that this misinformation and disinformation is intentional. This is a movement to use critical race theory as a lever for what? And so I think it would be great, it's not the question I wrote, but I think it's the question I want to know the answer to. And for what you think of is, you provide context about critical race theory and what it embodies, but what is the other side now using it for?
Sure.
And why, what do you think the end game, we all know the end game is really.
Sure. So I think this is an important question. And here, I think it's important to go to the source, right? And so Christopher Rufo is the conservative activist who's been sort of credited with starting the moral panic around critical race theory. And I'll talk about two things related to him at this part, and maybe we'll talk about him some more. But, and I cite this in the book, and I use it if I have a visual for the talk. He has this series of tweets in which he literally was like, we are attaching critical race theory to anything in American society that folks think this is his language, not mine, crazy, out there, and we're trying to de-index the sort of academic meaning of the term and associate it in people's minds, white Americans' minds, with anything they dislike from people of color, right? So that's part of it, being inexplicitly, and again, this is him, not me, an explicitly bad faith attack to delegitimize scholarship on race and ethnicity. He's also been very transparent about why he was doing this, right? And I think this is also very important, is he said that following the George Floyd protests, which some folks say were the largest mobilizations, anti-racist mobilizations in US history, he got nervous. And he's like, what's going on? You'll remember there were a number of books about race and ethnicity, like Kennedy's How to Be an Anti-Racist, Step from the Beginning, that shot up the like bestseller writers. So, Rufo's smart. He says he went and read those books, and he found, he traced the citations in those books back to some critical race theorists. Right? And so he said that once he found the term critical race theory, again, his words, not mine, he decided it was the perfect weapon to beat back the kinds of claims that people were asking for. And I think, those claims are pretty reasonable. Like, let's diversify professoriate, let's diversify corporations, let's deal with structural racism that's well documented, right? So Rufo said, I'm worried about these claims. I want to stop progress on these claims, and I'm going to use critical race theory as a weapon to do it, right? So I think it's, he was explicit about it. I think we should take him at his word. I don't think I need to theorize much beyond that. Them very clearly saying we are trying to beat back racial progress that we think is sort of dangerous to powerful Americans.
I guess my follow-up question to that, and we may not have an answer, you may not have an answer, but why was critical race theory trying to be this, what makes critical race theory the
I have lots
tool for that,
I have
right?
lots of
Okay,
answers to that.
that's,
So
yeah, these are
one of
my
the
questions.
one of my answers to that is that critical race theory arose initially to describe an earlier era of backlash, right? So when you read folks like Crenshaw or Delgado and Stefanchik, and they talk about the early movement, they say, look, and Derek Bell, who is here at Harvard Law School, Derek Bell and those folks were like, the civil rights movement activists in the NAACP used the law literally brilliantly, right? They crafted a decades-long strategy to delegitimize racism in American law, explicit racism in American law. And they were very successful in doing that, right? So we can think of, Brown v. Board, and then the legislation that came following that, all part of the NAACP strategy to use the law and change the law to provide protection. So Derek Bell and Crenshaw and a number of other folks, entered law school in the late 80s, the late 70s and early 80s, and they were looking at sort of Nixon and Reagan's explicit attempts to halt and turn back many of the advantages, many of the advances that particular legal strategy had made, right? And I think it's hard to overstate like how intense this sort of backlash was. Such that the NAACP wanted to get rid of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department under Reagan because they said it was doing more harm than good.
Oh, interesting.
Right? So like this was intense. This is actually the guy that gave us Clarence Thomas. He was head of the Civil Rights Division for part of this, right? So the critical race theorists were like, how is the law, which we've used so effectively to advance Black rights and rights of people of color more broadly, now being used as a weapon against us, right? And they said there's sort of a deeper structure of the law that in some cases advantages whites, and so we're going to excavate some colorblindness. Like this is probably these other sort of aspects of the law. And so I think I don't think Rufo necessarily has that history. He has a very different history of the rise of critical race theory. But I think the fact that they were trying to describe why this backlash was happening and the forces in American society that made it makes it a very dangerous set of ideas at this particular moment for folks who are engaged in backlash against racial violence, right? So I think that, yeah, I think that that's sort of the biggest answer, right?
What strikes me when I listen to you is that, that this same thing is happening within the women's rights at the same time, right? Because when you describe critical race theory and the law being used as a lever to create change, I think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because that's really what she did. And so I think about this intersectionality, which Kimberly Crenshaw writes a lot about, and this especially complicated space for Black women who are both, subject to differential treatment because they're Black and subject to differential treatment because they're women. And I think about these laws and how they're now being exactly what you said, both for women and for people of color, they're being used against them in a way, or the rug is being pulled out from underneath that. So I guess my question is, how do we combat that? What can we do? What should we be doing? And nothing like what I wrote down in my question.
Yeah, wow, you just catch me off guard.
Sorry, I can go back to these, but
no,
I
no.
should do it
So
again.
I think there's on this, I'm gonna say, like, all hands on deck,
Yeah,
right? So when I think about, so I get this question a lot. Folks are like, I'm worried, what should we do? And I'm like, I don't know what to do, but you should do something.
Yeah.
Right? So pick, I don't know, it doesn't necessarily have, so I have a friend, Stephen Thrasher, who says, like, pick what you're good at, but I am like, it doesn't have to be what you're good at. If there's something you want to learn, if it can help, right? Get together with a group of people and organize, right? So I think about, one of the reasons I wrote this book was like, this is something I can do in this moment, right? There's this moment in which a body of scholarship and a set of ideas that like literally changed the course of my life and that I think are very, very important to solving deeply entrenched problems in the United States is being misrepresented in a way that is harmful and I think dangerous, right? And what can I do? Well, I have a degree. I use these ideas in my research. I have some ability to write in an accessible way, and so I think I can try and clear some of the air around the misinformation about these ideas, right? But I think that there's a lot of stuff. I guess the other thing I'll say here is folks can do what the bad guys do, right? So we can run for students, right? You can go to the PTA meetings. You can make sure your library doesn't ban books that folks are trying to ban, right? You can do things on the local level in your community that sort of push back against what I think is a very dangerous policies that people are trying to do.
I'm just gonna have to second that because that's what we were talking about before. I'm a select board member for the town of Brookline, so I ran for local government, and I literally ran with the sole purpose, well, I shouldn't say this, but with a very focused purpose. And one of the things I wanted to do was get school resource officers out of my kids' school.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was that vote. I was the swing vote that removed armed police officers from my child's K through 8 and my child's high school. So I think that's right to think about it that way. I totally agree with you. So you've also written extensively about the challenges of organizational racial inequity. And I would love to hear how critical race theory applies to how we understand organizations and why, despite best intentions, they still continue to stay so very white.
So, so this is drawing on my work that I did before the book on racialized organizations. And I can think about this a couple of ways. So, when I think about, I'm going to give this sort of wonky sociology answer, and then maybe I can translate this. When I think about it in terms of sort of the history of organizational theory in sociology, there was work that looked at sort of like race in organizations, or sort of hiring discrimination, work I use and appreciate, work on diversity. But there wasn't a lot of work that said, like, look, race is a fundamental social relationship that shapes like how likely an organization is to form in the first place. Who's allowed to be included in an organization, right? So I think about, Harvard's doing the slavery project right now, right? We can think about sort of the proceeds from slavery that funded literally like generations of the elite in American society and how that created sort of an organization that hoarded resources and shaped the racial order at Harvard, not just in the United States, but really internationally, right? And we can think, and so, I'm talking about Harvard, let's not talk about Harvard. There's High Country News and a number of scholars have also pointed out that which funded land grant universities from stolen land from Native Americans, and it stole that land, and so like MIT is funded from that partially, right? And we can think about how the benefits from these organizations did not necessarily trickle down. Right? They created, like I said, the racial order. So I was trying to say, look, when we think about organizations, there's probably not race neutral organizations, right? And thinking about them as race neutral is like you're already kind of not. But if we go in saying that, like, look, this is a fundamental social relationship, we want to think about how organizations, folks getting together, coming together, include some folks, excludes others, and then what that means in terms of resource distribution, what that means in terms of people's life chances and their ability, in the paper I call it agency, but I'll say it sort of more clearly, like we know what segregated schools were designed to do, and we still have segregated schools in the United States, and they were designed to privilege one group and expand one group's opportunity and hobble permanently another group's opportunity to compete, right? And so yeah, I think I answered the question. Yeah.
So to me, there's this, again, I like these parallels. I like to think about, sounds a lot like that I'm colorblind, right? These organizations say that we're colorblind, right? And it's a workaround for them to continue with these structures that uphold white supremacy and uphold racism. And then we talk about the schools and the segregated schools, and this is my own, I have read some, and there's a great book, and I'm just absolutely blanking on the title, basically claim that Brown versus the Board of Education wasn't actually helpful for the cause of desegregation, and in fact, instead resulted in the loss of a really robust Black educational system. So I wonder if you have thoughts on that, and we can talk a little bit about.
So I do have thoughts on that, right? This is actually a very interesting question because Derek Bell, who was one of the founders of critical race theory, talks about this. He had what appear to be mixed feelings about his role in Brown v. Board, right? So I'm going to talk about this a couple of ways. One of the ways was he said that he felt that there was kind of what folks now call elite capture within the civil rights, and that is the most educated portions of Black America were pushing for desegregation. Other groups were saying, look, we just want resources and to have Black schools because certain aspects of white Americans are never going to accept integration, right? And so Bell, helped desegregate and then said later on, I don't know if this was the right route. That being said, personally, I don't know how I feel about this question. And the reason that I say that is the evidence on desegregation is that it worked in terms of things like closing the test score gap and increasing Black achievement overall, right? And that is not to say that desegregated schools did not have a whole host of problems, but the resources that they provided actually made a difference for education.
I think it's interesting, and I like to personalize things too. And I have a Black child in a predominantly white school, in a predominantly white neighborhood, and I definitely see both sides of that with his experience and his education. I don't know the answer myself, but I think it's something we don't talk about. So, right, we just kind of assume Brown versus Ford was good, but when you couch it in this, in the lens of critical race theory, I think you have to be more critical of it. So, all right, I'm just going back to my questions. So these studies have evolved and have contended with this backlash. My question really is, so we have this big backlash, and we talked a little bit about what we think the general public should do, but what is within critical race theory? Where are the next steps? How is critical race theory itself evolving?
So that's a hard question. So I think,
But
I think a couple of things. I think that, you know, there's folks like me who are trying to draw aspects of critical race theory into their fields, like sociology. I also think that, you know, in a weird way, like people are just doing empirical work with the theory, and not necessarily worried about what's going on outside, right? So I think, I mean, they're probably worried on a personal level, but I've talked to a lot of folks who are like, I'm just doing my research, right? I'm just doing my work. And like in a weird way, I talked to a number of like graduate students or postdocs who are doing work on schools at this moment. And they're like, some of this stuff is what critical race theory predicts, right? Like critical race theory talks about sort of the history of racial backlashes whenever there's a moment of progress. We can analyze white parents storming school boards in a long history of white parents sort of claiming certain kinds of rights for education for their kids. We can think about this in terms of prior movements to remove Black thought from schools, right? And so there's a way in which like what's happening right now, like it's one of those things where like you don't want to be right. like I would rather there not be a social movement targeting a set of ideas that I think are very important, but there's a weird way in which it confirms the importance of the ideas, especially like when the movement is actually in line with what the ideas claim. Yeah.
So this is something Professor Muhammad teaches in his class, actually. He really talks about this. We just relive these moments over and over again. The cycle goes over and over and over. Right? And so my question is, and maybe not so much related to critical race theory, although I think everything is in essence related to critical race theory at this point. Is there anything different about the George Floyd moment?
So different. So
I mean, that's it.
Yeah, I think I'm going to say a couple of things here that I think are right. So one thing that was pretty astounding about the George Floyd moment was for the first time you had some surveys, right? So let me just be clear, I'm not putting a whole lot of faith in these surveys, but you had some surveys showing that white Americans professed a greater belief in structural racism than Americans of color, right? And a lot of us were like, what? So now that's gone back down to like even worse than it was before the George Floyd moment. That's why I say I don't put like a lot of faith in that particular moment. But I think another thing that happened there with the size of the motivation, something happened in my classes. And that's, you know, I teach what 18 to 22-year-olds mostly. You know, I realize there's folks different ages there, but I had been teaching for what 5 or 6 years at that point, same groups. These students were like committed and worried. They realized that something was very wrong, and they were like doing the reading and trying to think through this and talk through it in a way that I had not felt, right? Like it was a different feeling. And I started teaching like literally like a week after my Brown shot, right? And this was more intense than that moment. And so one of the things that I've been saying is that, you know, you hear these Marks for Liberty groups, or these folks saying like, kids are too young to understand, or these ideas are going to make people feel bad, they're not going to get it, or it paints American in a bad light. And I've been like, actually, that's not what I think they're really worried about, right? What I think they're worried about is that like kids will understand clearly and that they'll judge them, right? Because like, I have a 10-year-old and there's nothing worse than like the times he's like, you are not living up to what you profess, right? And I think that like a lot of this is about trying to stop that, right? Like I mean, I hear folks say that like kids won't get this, and I'm like, well, I opened the book with an example of when I was 2, so like I didn't have a choice but to like start thinking about this at a very young age, right? So some folks don't have the choice of when they start to learn about this. But 2, like, there's nothing kids are more worried about 5, 6, 7 than like fairness,
Yes.
right? Like, and so I think that they would understand it. I think they understand it very clearly, and I think that that's the action. I think other parts of this movement, like the backlash, are very similar to, massive resistance following these in Virginia. So,
I'm gonna layer onto this because also I wonder, we saw this George Floyd moment happen in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So I always also wonder this kind of talk about intersectionality, but this confluence of the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd and how that makes this different, if at all. So you were teaching at the time. Do you think that the pandemic primed your students or in some way affected them so that they were even more ready for this George Floyd moment?
I don't know that the pandemic primed them. I think the restrictions that the pandemic imposed made certain kinds of protests less costly. Right? So lots of folks were home and had been home for months at that time. I don't remember the exact timeline because time works differently in that period of my brain.
Didn't everyone?
But like, so I think there's that. But what I actually think laid the groundwork for it, and I don't think it gets enough credit, is the years of the Black Lives Matter movement drawing attention to this. What I think primed people for it was saying, again, right? We've seen this with Brown, we've seen this with all of these other folks, Trayvon Martin, all of these other killings, and here we have another, right? And so, I think early on, I don't know if you all remember this, but it's like, in my mind, of folks saying like Black Lives Matter didn't do anything, they didn't achieve their goals, and I always thought it's a really short-sighted understanding of what social movements do. Social movements can change the way we think about the world without necessarily achieving a certain set of policy goals, right? And I think the George Floyd moment was one moment of fruition of changing the way people saw police violence against people of color in the United States.
So my last question, and then we'll open it up. And it's a little complicated. So we think of Black Lives Matter as a social movement. I think of critical race theory as it's an academic legal movement, right? And maybe there's this kind of Venn diagram where they overlap a little bit. I'm not a critical race theory scholar, so I just wonder what, if anything, critical race theory says about all this extrajudicial killings that happens. Is there a line of legal thought on how to address those?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think so. I don't know that there's a line of legal thought on how to address this, right? I'm a sociologist, and I think about critical race theory as it applies to my field. What I would say is, when I think about sort of history of movements against extrajudicial killings in the United States, I think about the long history of the NAACP fighting lynching.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a decades-long movement. It took decades for, we just got federal legislation. We just got federal anti-lynching legislation, I think this year. I might be wrong on that, so, don't hold me, look it up. But So I think that what, as a critical race theorist, what I would say is like movements, right? The kind of movements that led to the George Floyd moment are the kinds of movements that you might not see sort of come to fruition for decades.
Playing the long game.
Yeah. I mean, the anti-CRT folks are clearly
Playing the long game.
right?
Yeah, right. Do we have questions for anybody here? And yeah, please.
I've got one. You write a few times of the urgency of writing the book, and you wrote like in a 3-month period,
Yeah.
right? In a kind of flurry of responding to this misappropriation and misuse and targeting of CRT. You also talk about bittersweet that it's still relevant today, and CRT is still pilloried or kind of used by the right. But I would observe that it might be less so, and it kind of got eclipsed by woke as the new banner under which that the right can wage an agenda. Where does, in your mind, and for as someone wants to use this as a field guide, where does CRT sit in acting against, pushing against that narratives, either of CRT or woke or whatever the next thing is?
So, so let me just go on record. Like, I hate the word woke so much. The way it's been misappropriated by the way, I hate it so much, right? So, I think the easiest way to think about this is sort of one of two strands. Ian Haney Lopez has a great book called Dogmas of Politics, in which he sort of traces the rise of what my advisor Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls colorblind racism, right? And so, and then there's folks here at Harvard like Larry Bobo who tried something very similar, right? Following the civil rights movement, there was a concerted effort, which I talk about in the book, from political actors and regular folks to come up with a body of language that signaled racial animus and that activated racial animus for political purposes, but was plausibly denied, right? So, there's this quote I have in the book from Houdeman, who was one of Nixon's advisors, who quotes Nixon saying the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to make a system that recognizes that while appearing not to, right? And then I have a horrendous quote from the Atwater that talks about moving from using the N-word to talking about taxes and schooling in order to target, right? So maybe that was a long preface. All of that is to say, that's what the right is doing right now with woke and critical race, right? They are turning they're turning them into dogmas, right? They're trying to use language and ideas that in both cases came from either Black vernacular or woke or sort of Black thought, sort of writ large for critical race theory to delegitimize a set of ideas that are sort of held under those terms, right? So that was the question, how to fight it.
Yeah.
Oh, how does critical race theory fight it? I mean, you just show what they're doing, right? And so I think, when it comes to fighting this, one of the things that critical race theory does is like, it's a theory of like time. And that Derek Bell is like, look, you're going to be fighting this forever, right? So there's this way in which like a lot of times Americans are like, hey, what's the policy fix? And Derek Bell is like, there's no policy fix. There's a next step in which you sort of reduce harm. And then you realize some folks like harm and they're going to try and keep harming people. And then you figure out the next step to reduce harm again, right? And so, yeah, I don't think there's sort of a catch-all. I think it's a recognition of like, you got to keep it moving. And when they ban AP Black History in Florida, you, like folks here are doing, you develop a national program to try and push back against banning AP Black History, right?
I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, so when you talk about organizations, which most people have to work in organizations to survive, and the fact that you're bringing up that they're not race neutral, that there is products, processes, different ideas that are coming from organizations that can harm racial ethnic minorities. How do you suggest people who are within organizations like help organizations interrogate, you know, processes, products, ideas that come out of organizations when that's not necessarily something that they do naturally?
So I have a couple of answers to this. One is, you got to keep your job. So,
Right.
so
Unless you're a tenured professor.
unless
Go
you
ahead.
still have to keep the job, but think about how you're going to navigate care, right? So I think it depends on where one is located in the organization for doing this, right? So I'm going to get in trouble, but one thing I would say is, if you're a worker, unionization helps, right? Collective action helps. We know that can sort of redistribute resources. The other thing I'll say is when I think about, so the way we talk about racism or structural racism in organizations in American life, generally not sociologists, but lots of folks do, is about interpersonal folks being mean to each other, right? Someone sort of hurt my feelings. That is important. Not going to minimize that. We know that over time, literally leads to early death, right?
Right.
But I think about structural racism as a system of resource distribution. And so if you want to minimize structural racism, you look at how resources are distributed within an organization, right? And so an example I use, because we're in an institute of higher ed, is we know there's good research that say women and women of color specifically are overtaxed for certain service positions or certain requests from, say, students of color who feel that they're not being appreciated at the university, right? So one way to do that, what a lot of folks do is yep, we recognize that, and we're going to evaluate the tender cases, not taking that into account, and we're not going to think about that in terms of resources. Another way to do it is say, this is actually work that the university values. We're going to keep track of it, and we have this pot of money for research. We're going to actually give it to the folks who are doing this work to ensure that their time is compensated, and they might have resources to use for their research that we know this is taking time, right? So you think about it not in terms of changing people's hearts and minds, which again, it is important. I'm not going to say that, but think about it in terms of how do we equalize opportunities and resources? I'll stop there. I could say.
So just a shout out to those listening online. They can also ask questions. We haven't gotten any
Okay.
yet, but there is an online audience watching. And thank you so much for being here, Victor. I just wanted to circle back to the article of yours on a theory of racialized organizations, which we have featured in our database. And building on our Tara's question, ask a bit about how, you specifically talk about how multiple mechanisms reinforce or reproduce inequality in organizations. And I think you started to talk about this just now, but when you talk about organizations being white and maintaining whiteness, can you drill down even more to what you write about in terms of the mechanisms that are reproducing inequality at different levels?
Sure. This is another thing I'll talk about two ways, right? So there's this long history in sociology of what folks call bias, right? And so what these are, as quickly as possible, is you send two people of different races, typically black and white, out to say, apply for jobs, apply for apartments, apply for, literally try and get on a bus without paying, right? And these often show the exact same thing, right? That there's kind of rampant discrimination against most often black, right? So that's one, right? And we have a lot of measures showing that. but we don't have audit studies to say that like, as clearly like what happens at sort of the first year evaluation, and then your second year evaluation. So on the one hand, we measure discrimination sort of going in, and there are folks like making Quillian now trying to get at some of this. But like race doesn't just stop impacting your trajectory once you're in the door. It pushes some folks up the ladder and it keeps some folks from climbing, right? And so so those are two different mechanisms, right? One is hiring discrimination, one is differential treatment of the job. Another way I'll talk about this is what happened, and this is drawing on the work of folks like Carolyn Tyson and John Diamond and Lewis, is what happened during school desegregation. Is you had segregation between schools, which is what folks in the South were, with the civil rights movement was trying to get at. And I say folks in the South, but actually the North is worse. So you had segregation between schools, and then, Brownlee Board happened, some schools integrated, and you got segregation within schools through tracking programs, right? Or through differential treatment of students in the same classrooms, right? And so you went from very effective mechanism of between school segregation to a whole set of new mechanisms of segregation. So this goes back to the idea that like I talked about earlier of there's not going to be a policy that ends it, right? You need to think about, okay, this is going to solve some problems. There's going to be unintended consequences and
I have to say again, in terms of some of my sons in high school, the high school is currently undertaking a de-leveling all of their classes. So they detracked and de-leveled social studies, and it's completely anecdotal. This is the class my son does the best in. So I think these things are really important because this is in fact, so now the solution is now they segregate the tracking. Now we have to de-level and segregate tracking. And something will come in its place. I think that's the lesson here, right? Yeah. Something will come in its place. So what? Then we'll have to deal with it once it happens. Do we have any more questions? So
maybe I'll ask a final one.
Go ahead.
As we look to this summer and all the organizing happening, both from academics and scholars and educators, like what should we be watching for? Like based on what you've written about, if we want to learn from what all the critical race theorists have been saying and have been studying, like what should we be watching for? I think Miriam asked, like, how should we be organizing? I guess based on the scholarship, what should we be, like with what eye should we be looking?
So I am really reluctant to tell organizers how to organize. Right? I'm an academic and I think about this in certain terms, and I used to do like organizing. And I remember like bristling when outside folks would come and say, like, you need to do this, and be like, you don't understand the current conditions, right? And so like, let me give an example of this, right? So I am pretty critical of like diversity programming for certain reasons, for being, not following through, what sort of watering down what's actually happening. And I've written about this and I've talked to them. And then, I started my career at the University of Tennessee, and they were kind of a pilot for what's happening nationally now. While I was there in, I think, my first year as an assistant professor, they closed the diversity office, fired the single black male administrator, and redistributed $400,000 away from the diversity office to other programs on campus, right? So here I was, critical of diversity programs, and the students came to me. It's not a good idea as a first year assistant, but I did it. They came to me and they said, hey, will you help us think about this and come to some protests? And I was like, I'm critical of diversity programming, but actually you lost space. So even though I'm critical of this, like conditions on the ground mean I actually am sort of committed to helping you all do what I can, right? And so I think it's important to like think about, yeah, you should have a national movement, but you have to be aware of local conditions and have the humility to say like, I don't know what's going on, or I gotta revise my thinking on this because these folks have like real needs. I think another way to think about this is sort of like harm reduction versus long-term goals, right? How do I help people who are hurting or sort of under the gun, for lack of a better term, right now, versus how do I reach a place in which like having a diversity office would be silly because the organization would be functioning in a way in which a diversity office is no longer necessary, right? And I think you can try and hold both of those things together.
And I just have to say for the record, organizing does work because the AP board just announced this week that they're going back to fix the AP African American Studies curriculum. So we have evidence that we can push and
Does
make these changes.
Yeah, it
Yes,
does.
absolutely does work. Any other questions? So I thank you so much.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate you tolerating me going completely off script with all my questions. It's typical and why I typically not ask the moderator. And I just, yeah, really appreciate you and the work you do.
I appreciate the invitation.
Next year, next academic.
And we have some refreshments, I believe,